A driveway is a simple promise. It is the path that welcomes you home. For Calvin Hayes, a retired engineer looking for a quiet life. That path was everything. But in the historic community of the Oaks of Savannah, the Homeowners Association saw things differently. They saw a violation, and so they blocked his driveway, not with a temporary barrier, but with the quiet permanence of a freshly planted tree, a living wall, sanctioned by their rules, a calculated move to obstruct his way home. So what does a man do when his final path to peace is deliberately blocked? A man who spent his life building bridges to connect the world. He doesn't just argue. He doesn't just fight. He builds a moat they can't cross. This is the story of how a single act of obstruction led to one of the most brilliant acts of defiance you will ever see. We invite you to find out why. And if you believe in finding your own path, consider subscribing to Dipu Cater Stories. The Moat and the Ghost. The house sat on a street shaded by ancient oaks. Their branches, draped in Spanish moss, filtered the Georgia sun into a soft, dappled light. A small, elegant sign stood at the entrance to the community. The paint was immaculate. It read, "The Oaks of Savannah, managed by the HOA." On this particular morning in May, the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and fresh concrete. Calvin Hayes stood on his lawn. A perfect lawn. He was 68 years old. A man built like the bridges he used to design. Solid. Practical. Before him, his work was finished. A moat. It was 6 feet wide, lined meticulously with gray river stones. It traced the border of his property, a clean, undeniable line drawn in the earth. In his hand, a small remote. He pressed the button. There was a quiet hum, the clean sound of hydraulics. A bridge made of teak and steel slowly lowered, connecting his driveway to the cobblestone street. It settled into place with a soft, final click. A had done it. They had blocked his driveway. A slow, methodical campaign of rules and violations. So he had built a moat they could not cross. From the porch next door, Charles Alston appeared. He held 2 tall glasses of iced tea, condensation tracing paths down their sides. He was a man whose gentle eyes had seen the slow turning of Savannah's history. He shook his head. Avere. Knowing motion. A smile, part disbelief and part admiration, touched his lips. "Calvin," he said, his voice a low, southern rumble. "I've seen a lot of things in this town. A whole lot of things. But I have never ever seen this." He took a slow sip of his tea. "For the love of God, son, tell me how it came to this." The memory did not rush back. It seeped in. Like the Savannah humidity, 1 year earlier, Calvin's arrival had been quiet, a single moving truck. No fanfare. He was a newcomer from Baltimore, a widower seeking, not peace. Peace felt too ambitious. He was seeking order, a place where things made sense. The house he bought was a classic Savannah graystone, larger than one man could ever need. The silence inside was a physical presence. It filled the empty rooms where his wife, Eleanor, should have been. He unpacked with the precision of an engineer fleeing from chaos. Tools in the garage were not merely stored. They were arranged, wrenches by size, screwdrivers by type, each in its designated foam cutout. In the library, books were not just shelved. They were alphabetized, by author, then by title. This was his ritual, his defense against a world that had proven to be random and cruel. He needed control. Over something. Over anything. In the mailbox that first week, there was a welcome packet, bound in faux leather. Inside, a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, and the book, a thick, heavy book of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Calvin, a man who had spent his life reading blueprints and municipal codes. Read it from cover to cover. He saw the rules not as a burden, but as a promise of predictability, of order. He would follow the rules. He would be a good neighbor. He would be invisible. The first conflict was born from something beautiful, en à bouche, a vibrant splash of magenta he had planted in a heavy ceramic pot and placed beside his walkway. He thought it brought a touch of life to the manicured perfection of the neighborhood. A small, personal touch. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. The envelope was thick. Cream-colored cardstock. The logo of the Oaks of Savannah HOA was embossed at the top, an ornate oak tree inside a perfect circle. Inside, just a single sheet of paper. There was no greeting. It cited Section 4, Subsection C, the placement of ornamental planters. His azalea pot, it explained, was 2 inches too far to the left of the designated zone. It encroached upon the mandated 36-inch clearance from the walkway's edge. A violation. The letter was signed, not with a name, but with a title, the Office of the President, and beneath it, a signature written in sharp, elegant ink, Geneviève Devereaux. The name felt old. It felt heavy. Calvin felt a flicker of annoyance. Nothing more. It was an error, an oversight. He went to his garage, retrieved his tape measure, and went back to the pot. He measured. The pot was, indeed, 2 inches off. He sighed, a quiet breath of resignation. He was a man who respected precision. He nudged the heavy pot with his foot, moving it into compliance. The problem was solved. He was a man who solved problems. He went inside, crumpled the letter, and tossed it into the trash. He thought nothing more of it. He did not know it yet. He could not have known. He had just touched the first thread of a web woven with tradition and unspoken rules long before he ever arrived. It was a web of quiet power, of polite smiles that hid iron wills, and in the center of that web sat the HOA. The weight of tradition. The letters kept coming. They arrived with the quiet certainty of the tide. Not daily, but often enough to become a presence, a weight in the day. Calvin began to recognize the feel of the cream-colored cardstock before he even saw the logo. The violations grew more personal, more invasive. A single drop of oil on his driveway. A dark tear on the pristine concrete. A fine. $100. The blinds in his study, he was informed, were the color of cream. The rules, in Section 7, Subsection F, clearly stipulated a color of off-white. A warning. Correct the issue within 14 days. Each letter was a small, calculated intrusion into the ordered world he was trying to build. A world where he controlled the variables. His home was meant to be his fortress against the ghosts of Baltimore. Against memory. Instead, the walls were being breached. Paper cut by paper cut, the fines began to accumulate. They were not crippling. Not yet. But they were a steady drain on a fixed income. A financial worry he had not anticipated in his plans for retirement. It was another loss of control. Another variable he could not solve with a slide rule and a blueprint. One afternoon, standing by his mailbox with another letter in hand, he felt a presence beside him. It was Charles Alston, holding a glass of iced tea. The ice cubes clinked softly. Another love letter from the Queen? I see, Charles said. His voice was gentle. Calvin simply nodded. Folding the paper, Charles looked at Calvin's house. Then he looked back at the man himself. He saw the weariness behind the engineer's steady gaze. He spoke of the Beaumonts, an old family, a family tied to the very soil of Savannah. He told Calvin that Geneviève Devereaux did not see the Oaks of Savannah as a collection of houses. She saw it as the last, fading portrait of her family's legacy. Every blade of grass, every color of paint, was a brushstroke she had to control, to preserve, She's not just enforcing rules. Calvin, Charles said, his voice dropping lower. She's fighting against time itself. And you are a new, unplanned detail in her masterpiece. Calvin decided logic was still his best weapon. He would attend the quarterly meeting for the Homeowners Association, HOA. He would present his case. He prepared for it like he would for a municipal hearing. He created a folder. Inside, copies of the letters, photographs of the violations, with measurements. A calm, written appeal, citing the vagueness of certain rules. He was prepared. He was logical. He believed, still, that logic would prevail. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. The room smelled of lemon polish and old paper. 10 other residents were there. They sat in silence, their hands folded on the long mahogany table. At the head of the table sat Genevieve Devereaux. She wore a silk blouse and a single strand of pearls. She looked less like a community president and more like a monarch holding court. When it was his turn, Calvin stood. He spoke calmly. He laid out his facts. He presented his folder. He spoke of reason. He spoke of fairness. The room was silent when he finished. Genevieve did not look at his folder. She looked directly at him. Her eyes were dark. And for a moment, Calvin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She did not speak of rules or violations. She spoke of harmony. She spoke of tradition. She spoke of the spirit of a place. She spoke of the aesthetic integrity that generations of families had worked to preserve. Then, she turned her attention to the rest of the room. She spoke of newcomers, people from the north, people who understood concrete and steel, perhaps, but who did not understand the delicate soul of Savannah. She never said his name. She did not have to. Calvin felt the weight of 10 pairs of eyes on him. He was no longer a neighbor with a grievance. He was an outsider, a disruption, an error in the code. He packed his folder. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He had brought a calculator to a battle of ghosts. He walked home under the oak trees. The setting sun cast long shadows across his perfect lawn. The silence in his house was deeper than usual. That night, sleep did not come easily. And when it did, it brought a dream. The dream was always the same. He was standing on a bridge in Baltimore. The air was cold. He could feel the vibration of the traffic through the soles of his shoes. He looked down and saw it. A hairline fracture in a steel support beam. A tiny, insignificant crack. The kind of thing you could miss if you weren't looking hard enough. He looked up, and Eleanor was there. In her car, driving toward him. She was smiling, waving, and he was frozen. A man of logic, paralyzed by a future he could already see. The sound of screeching metal, the silence that followed, the weight of it. He woke up in the dark. The sheets damp with sweat. The feeling of helplessness was the same. The quiet, suffocating knowledge that he had failed to see the flaw in the structure. Then, and now, the final street raw. The letters stopped. For a full month, Calvin's mailbox held nothing but utility bills and catalogs for things he would never buy. A quiet truce seemed to have settled over the Oaks of Savannah. He allowed himself a cautious sense of relief. Perhaps the meeting had been the end of it. Perhaps Genevieve Devereaux had found another imperfection to focus on. He began to sleep a little better. He even thought about taking his old truck out of the garage, just to tinker with the engine. That was his mistake. He mistook silence for peace. One Tuesday morning, he was woken not by his alarm, but by the low rumble of a truck and the sound of men's voices. He went to the window. A landscaping crew was on the strip of grass between the street and his property. The public easement. They were digging a large hole. An hour later, they were gone, and in their place was a tree. It was a young live oak, no more than 10 feet tall. A sapling. To any passerby, it looked like a lovely addition to the neighborhood's historic charm. An act of civic beautification. Calvin knew better. He walked outside, his slippers damp from the morning dew. He stood on his driveway and looked at the tree. They had planted it in the most precise, the most strategic, the most devastatingly perfect spot. It did not block his driveway completely. That would have been too obvious. Too crude for Genevieve Devereaux. Instead, it sat just at the edge of the driveway's curve. A silent, leafy sentinel. To get his sedan out of the garage now would require a three-point turn, a delicate dance of forward and reverse. The car's sensors screaming with each inch he gained. Getting his old pickup truck out, that was now a mathematical impossibility. It was an act of aggression disguised as gardening. It was a checkmate delivered with a shovel. And it was all perfectly, maddeningly legal. A notice, posted on the community bulletin board, announced a new initiative for historical landscape restoration. It was, of course, approved by the HOA. For Calvin, the oak tree was more than an inconvenience. It was a symbol. It was an echo of a ghost he had lived with for 5 long years. A crack in a bridge support. He saw it in his mind, clear as the morning sun. A hairline fracture. He had seen it on an inspection report months before Eleanor's accident. It was minor, within acceptable tolerance levels. He had made a note. He had intended to schedule a follow-up, but then a larger project came up. A budget shortfall. The paperwork got buried. He had let it go. The official investigation had cleared him. It had cleared his firm. The accident was the other driver's fault. Drunk driving, speeding, but that single, undeniable fact remained. A crack. He was the engineer. It was his job to see the things others missed, and he had missed it. Or worse, he had seen it, and he had failed to act. He had failed to control the one variable he was responsible for. Now, standing on his driveway, that feeling of helpless failure washed over him again. The little oak tree became the crack in the concrete. The HOA became the random, cruel force of fate. The past and the present collapsed into one suffocating moment. He felt the same powerlessness, the same cold knot of guilt in his stomach. That night, he did not sleep. He did not even try. He went into his home office, a room he rarely used. He turned on the desk lamp. Its warm glow pushing back the shadows. Rolled up blueprints from his old life stood in tall canisters in the corner. Diagrams of overpasses. Stress calculations for steel girders. A lifetime of imposing order onto chaos. He had tried to be reasonable. He had tried to be logical. He had tried to argue his case. A had lost. He would not argue again. He would not move away. He would not surrender his home. This last sanctuary of order he had tried to build. He looked at the offending oak tree through the window, a dark silhouette against the moonlit street. He would solve this problem, not as a neighbor, but as an engineer. He pulled out a large, clean sheet of vellum paper, the kind he used for final drafts. He secured it to his drafting table. He picked up a graphite pencil. Its point was perfectly sharp. A took a deep, steadying breath. His hand, which had trembled earlier, was now perfectly still. He drew a straight line, then another. Lines of property, lines of setback. Then, with the cool precision of a surgeon, he began to draw a new line, a line that followed the contours of his land, a line that created a barrier, a line that would reclaim his control. The idea for the moat was not born from anger. It was born from grief. From necessity, it was not a wild act of defiance. It was a technical solution to a human problem. Calvin Hayes was faced with a choice: accept injustice, or engineer his own solution. In our own lives, we sometimes face these oak trees planted in our path. Have you ever had to find a creative solution to a problem that felt impossible? Share your story in the comments below. We would be honored to hear it. The architecture of resistance. Calvin Hayes did not get angry. Anger was a chaotic force, an unpredictable variable. And Calvin, above all else, was a man who dealt in variables he could control. The young oak tree planted by the HOA was not an insult. It was a problem. And problems had solutions. He did not rush. For 3 weeks, the oak sapling stood as a silent testament to Genevieve Devereaux's power, and for 3 weeks, Calvin's car sat untouched in the garage. His new routine involved walking to the grocery store. It was a long walk, but it gave him time to think. His battlefield was not the perfectly manicured lawns of the Oaks. It was the quiet, dust-filled aisles of the Savannah Municipal Law Library. The place smelled of old paper and decaying glue, a scent that reminded him of his first engineering internship. It was a comfort. Here, there were no emotions. There were only rules, and Calvin knew that for every rule, there was a boundary. For every boundary, there was a loophole. He spent hours hunched over a heavy wooden table. The thick rulebook of the Homeowners Association HOA opened before him. He read it not like a homeowner, but like a demolition expert studying a building's schematics. Searching for the single point of weakness, he found it on page 87. Fences. The section on fences was a masterpiece of control. It detailed height, material, color, and spacing down to the quarter inch. It was an iron wall of text. But then came the section on landscaping features: ponds, fountains, water gardens. It was strangely vague, almost an afterthought. It spoke of aesthetic harmony and prohibited features of an excessive size, but offered no precise measurements. It was a crack in the foundation, a small one, but it was enough. His evenings were spent with Charles Alston. Charles would appear on his porch as the sun began to set, 2 glasses of bourbon in hand. He never talked about the HOA directly. Not at first. Instead, he talked about Savannah. He told stories of old family rivalries that played out over generations, of polite feuds waged with poisoned compliments and strategic garden parties. "You have to understand, Calvin," Charles said one evening, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "This isn't about an oak tree. Not really. It's about history. Genevieve Devereaux isn't just protecting a neighborhood. She's protecting a memory of a time when her family's name meant something more than it does today." It was Charles who first mentioned the lawyer. "Pierce Dalton. He's not one of us," Charles explained, his voice low. "He's new money. Sharp. Ambitious. He orbits Genevieve like a moon. But he doesn't care about her traditions. Men like Pierce Dalton only care about one thing: opportunity." Charles spoke of whispers. Rumors of Dalton buying up properties quietly. Of a larger plan for the Oaks that no one quite understood. It was a piece of information that didn't fit the puzzle. Not yet. But Calvin filed it away. With his research complete, Calvin drove his rental car, a small sedan that fit easily past the oak tree, to City Hall. The building was old, grand, and inefficient. He waited for 2 hours in a hard plastic chair. When his number was called, he walked to the counter with a set of rolled-up blueprints under his arm. He was no longer just a homeowner. He was an engineer. He presented his plan to the city zoning clerk, a tired woman who looked like she'd seen everything. "It's a koi pond," Calvin said, his voice calm and steady. He unrolled the plans. They were immaculate, drawn to scale, with precise measurements, water displacement calculations, and a detailed soil erosion prevention plan, a decorative water feature for landscape enhancement. The clerk peered at the drawings through her bifocals. She saw the work of a professional. She saw every I dotted, every T crossed. She asked about the filtration system. Calvin explained the closed loop, low-impact design. She asked about the depth. Calvin pointed to the specifications, well within the city's residential code. She saw no reason to say no. There was nothing to deny. He walked out of City Hall an hour later, a signed and stamped permit in his hand, a legal document, a shield. Meanwhile, a phone call was made. The zoning clerk, as required by procedure for any significant landscape modification in a historic district, had sent a courtesy copy of the permit to the registered HOA. The papers landed on Pierce Dalton's polished mahogany desk. He stared at them. À quoi bon? It sounded harmless, ridiculous, even. But coming from Calvin Hayes, it felt wrong. He scanned the blueprints. They were perfect. Too perfect. He called Genevieve. "It's a pond," he told her, a note of confusion in his slick, professional voice. "He's building a pond." Genevieve was silent on the other end of the line. She could feel it. A subtle shift in the balance of power, a move on the board she did not recognize. The preparation was complete. Calvin had the law on his side. He had the permit in his hand, and he had a design for something far more ambitious than a simple pond. He was ready. The quiet man from Baltimore was about to make a very loud statement. Without saying a single word, Ampère's boundary made of water. The silence in the Oaks of Savannah was a carefully curated thing. It was broken on a Monday morning by the groan of diesel, un excavator. Yellow and brutally functional, rolled down the cobblestone street. It stopped in front of Calvin's house. Its arrival was a declaration. A line had been crossed, the work began. The rhythmic scrape and dump of the machine's bucket digging into the earth was a sound that did not belong here. It was the sound of disruption. The sound of change. The neighborhood watched, curtains twitched. A face would appear in a window, then vanish. Some neighbors, when walking their dogs, would hurry past Calvin's property, their gazes fixed straight ahead. Fear was a palpable thing. Fear of association. Fear of drawing the Queen's attention, but others lingered. A slow, deliberate nod from a man trimming his hedges across the street. A woman getting her mail who offered a small, tight smile of encouragement. These were the quiet ones. The ones who had endured years of Genevieve's rule in simmering silence. They saw Calvin not as a troublemaker, but as a champion. They were too afraid to be themselves. From behind the lace curtains of her ancestral home, Genevieve Devereaux watched it all. Every scoop of dirt felt like a personal insult. Every turn of the machine's treads was a desecration. She was powerless. It was a feeling she was not accustomed to. He had the city permit, his plans. She had been informed by a seething Pierce Dalton. Adhered perfectly to the bylaws of the Homeowners Association HOA. He had used her book of rules. Her book, he had used it against her. Hier Enge, once a cool and distant thing, began to burn with a new heat. It was no longer about the aesthetic integrity of the community. It was no longer about tradition. It was about Calvin Hayes. For Calvin, the noise and the dirt were a strange kind of solace. When the excavator finished its work, the true labor began. His labor. He had ordered pallets of river stone, smooth, gray stones, each one different. He worked from sunup to sundown. He mixed mortar in a wheelbarrow. He laid each stone by hand. The ache in his shoulders at the end of the day was a clean pain. It was simple, honest. It was a welcome replacement for the complicated ache that usually resided in his chest. The blisters that formed on his palms were proof of tangible effort. He was not just fighting back against the HOA. He was building something. Each stone he lifted had weight, a tangible problem he could solve. He could see his progress. He could touch it. This was a world away from the ghosts of his past. The flaw in the bridge had been invisible, a hairline crack hidden in a mountain of steel, a catastrophic failure born from a detail too small to see until it was too late. But here, every detail was in his hands. He was in control. One evening, he did not go inside when darkness fell. He sat on the cool grass beside the unfinished moat. The moon was high, casting a silver light on the still water that had collected at the bottom of the trench. The air was quiet again, filled only with the sound of crickets. He thought of Eleanor, and for the first time since the accident, the memory that came was not of the bridge. It was not of the screeching metal or the terrible silence that followed. He remembered the way she laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. He remembered the scent of the lemon verbena she grew in a pot by the back door. He remembered the feeling of her hand in his during their long, quiet walks. The good things, the small, perfect details that had built a life. He realized he had been so focused on the catastrophic ending that he had started to forget the story itself. The grief had been a wall, impenetrable. This trench, it was not just a line against Genevieve Devereaux. It was a space, a quiet place he had dug for himself, where the past could finally breathe. It was a boundary, yes, but it was also becoming something else entirely, a place to begin again. The unintended consequence. The moat was done. The final stone was set. The last gear in the hydraulic bridge calibrated. For the first time in a year, Calvin Hayes felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his bones. It was not the feeling of victory. It was the feeling of balance, of order, finally restored. He stood on his perfect lawn, looking at the clean line of water and stone that now defined his world. A line had been drawn. A problem had been solved. He saw Charles Alston emerge onto his porch next door. Holding his customary glass of iced tea, Charles simply looked at the moat, then at Calvin, and gave a slow, single nod. It was a gesture of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity and the necessity of it all. For a moment, there was peace. The peace lasted for 2 days. The catalyst for its end was not a letter from the HOA. It was not a confrontation with Genevieve Devereaux. It was a family from Ohio on vacation. They were driving slowly down the historic street, admiring the old houses. When they saw it, the father, stopped the car. He stared. He pulled out his phone. There was a soft click, a brief flash of a screen as he typed a caption. And then, he drove away. He had no idea what he had just done. The first sign for Calvin was a car that slowed down a little too much as it passed his house. Then another. By the weekend, people were stopping. They would park across the street, get out, and take pictures. Calvin watched from behind his living room curtains, a cold feeling of dread creeping back in. This was not the attention he wanted. This was the opposite of the invisibility he craved. On Monday, Charles called him. His voice was grim. "Calvin," he said, "you might want to stay off the internet for a while. You're on it." The story had grown legs. The tourist's photo had been shared, then shared again. Someone gave it a name, the HOA Moat. Someone gave Calvin a name, Moat Man. It became a symbol, a story of one man's quiet, brilliant rebellion against petty tyranny. It was no longer his story. It belonged to the world now. By Wednesday, the first news van arrived. A stark white vehicle with a satellite dish on top. It parked across the street. A reporter stood on the sidewalk, speaking into a camera about the David and Goliath struggle in the heart of historic Savannah. Calvin felt like a prisoner in his own fortress. The moat, built to keep one person's influence out, had become a magnet, drawing the entire world in. The quiet he had fought so hard to reclaim was shattered by the relentless hum of the news van's generator and the occasional honk of a supportive driver passing by. He did not answer the door. He did not answer the phone. His newfound fame was a nightmare, but for Genevieve Devereaux, it was something far worse. She did not see it from her window. She saw it on her television. In her immaculate sitting room, surrounded by the portraits of her ancestors, she watched a national news segment about her community, her home. She saw Calvin's house. She saw the moat. And then she saw her own photograph, a formal portrait, displayed on the screen next to the words HOA Karen. Her name, the Beaumont name, which had commanded respect in Savannah for 2 centuries, was now a punchline, a meme. Her carefully preserved world of tradition and dignity was being dismantled by hashtags and sarcastic comments from strangers who had never set foot in Georgia. The humiliation was a fire in her chest, hotter than any anger she had felt before. This was not just a violation of the rules. This was a desecration of her legacy, She sat in the silence of her grand house for a long time. The television was off now. The only sound was the slow, steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Her face, reflected in the dark screen, was a mask of cold fury. She picked up the phone. She dialed a number from memory. Pierce Dalton answered on the second ring. His voice was smooth, professional. "Genevieve," he said, "I've been seeing the news. A difficult situation." Her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly level, devoid of all emotion. "Mr. Dalton," she said, cutting through his pleasantries, "this is no longer a difficult situation. This is a war." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I do not care what it costs," she continued, her words like chips of ice. "I do not care what it takes. You will find something, anything, a forgotten ordinance, a misplaced comma in the city code. I want you to go through every law, every rule, every historical document this city has ever produced." She took a breath. "And you will bury him with it." The historical trap. The victory was not loud. It was a quiet, internal hum of satisfaction for Calvin. The moat was complete. The online stories had faded. The reporters were gone. Life in the Oaks of Savannah had settled into a new kind of normal. A tense, watchful peace. Genevieve Devereaux was no longer sending letters. Calvin thought, perhaps, that he had won, that it was over. He had forgotten that a cornered queen does not simply surrender. She finds a different weapon. Pierce Dalton found it, not in the thick, leather-bound book of the HOA. He was more clever than that. He spent days in the city archives, a place that smelled of dust and decaying paper. He wasn't looking for building codes. He was looking for history. And he found it. A single, forgotten ordinance from the 1972. A law created to protect the historic character of Savannah. The Oaks of Savannah, it turned out, was built on land designated as a site of historical significance, and the law contained a vague, powerful clause. It forbade any significant alteration of natural hydrology without the express approval of the Savannah Historic Heritage Commission, a commission that had never been consulted, a commission that Genevieve Devereaux's family had helped establish. The letter that arrived was not cream-colored. It was a harsh, Oficial Manila. It did not have the embossed logo of the HOA. It had the seal of the Municipal Court of Savannah. Calvin opened it in his library. His hands were steady. He was not prepared for the words inside. It was not a warning. It was not a fine. It was an injunction, a court order. He was commanded to cease and desist and to restore the property to its original state. Dismantle the moat. He had 30 days. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. He sank into his leather chair. The silence of the house pressed in. He had fought his war on his own terms. He had used logic. He had followed the rules. Their rules, but he had lost a war he never knew he was fighting. The feeling was sickeningly familiar. It was the feeling of a blind spot, a single, overlooked detail that unravels everything. The hairline crack on the bridge. He did not leave his house for 2 days. He sat in the dark, the court order on the table beside him, a monument to his failure, but he was no longer truly alone. Charles Alston saw the change. He saw the drawn curtains, the unanswered phone calls. He went over, not with iced tea, but with a quiet determination. He found Calvin sitting in the dark and simply sat with him. In the silence, Calvin finally told him everything. About the bridge, about Eleanor, about the crushing weight of a mistake that could never be undone. Charles listened. He did not offer platitudes. He simply listened. When Calvin was finished, his voice raw with a grief, 5 years old, Charles knew what he had to do. This was no longer about a moat. It was about a man. He gathered the neighbors, not all of them, just the ones who had offered the quiet nods and the small, brave smiles. He gathered them in his own living room, away from prying eyes. He told them about the court order, He told them Calvin was on the verge of giving up. And then he told them another story. A secret he had kept for a long time out of a complex sense of pity and respect. He told them about Genevieve Devereaux. He told them about a warm summer afternoon 15 years ago. About her grandnephew, a bright, laughing boy of 6, chasing a ball into the street. He told them about the speeding car, a contractor's truck that was not supposed to be there, driven by a man who was breaking the rules. He told them how the tragedy had broken something inside Genevieve, how her grief had curdled into an obsession with control. The rules were no longer about aesthetics. They were about preventing chaos from ever touching her world again. Every violation, no matter how small, was the ghost of that speeding truck. The room was silent. The anger toward the HOA queen was replaced by a sudden, complicated wave of understanding, of sadness. They were not fighting a tyrant. They were fighting a ghost. That evening, as they planned their appeal to the city, the local news was on the television in the corner of Charles's living room. The weatherman stood in front of a satellite map. A swirling white mass was churning in the Atlantic. Still too early to predict the exact path, the weatherman said, his voice cheerful. But we are keeping a close eye on a tropical storm that has just been upgraded. They're calling her Eleanor. Calvin looked up at the screen. The name hit him like a physical blow. Of all the names in the world, it was a sign, a cruel joke from a universe that had not finished with him yet. The storm of the past was no longer just a memory. It was coming for him. The cleansing street orm. Hurricane Eleanor did not arrive. It descended. The sky, a bruised purple, unleashed a wind that screamed through the ancient oaks. It was a primal sound, a sound of things breaking, and then came the noise that was different. Not a screech, but a deep, groaning tear, a sound like the world itself was splitting apart. It was followed by a colossal crash that shook the very foundations of the houses. The great oak was down. For 200 years, it had stood as the silent, living monument of the Oaks of Savannah, the symbol of the community. Now, it lay across the cobblestone road, a fallen giant. Its massive trunk blocked the only way in or out, but it had not fallen cleanly. In its death throe, its roots, thick as a man's waist, had ripped a wound in the earth, a wound that had severed the main water line. Water began to pour out. Not a leak, a torrent. It mixed with the relentless rain, and the street began to disappear. A shallow, churning river was forming, and it was rising. Fast. Panic was a quiet thing at first. A face in a window, watching the water creep up the lawn. A phone call that wouldn't go through. The growing realization that they were trapped, isolated, inside his house. Calvin Hayes felt the tremor of the trees fall. He stood at his library window, watching the water. He was not panicked. He was calculating. He saw the slope of the land, the flow of the current, the rate of the rise. For the first time in 5 years, the engineer inside him woke up. Not the man haunted by a single, fatal flaw, but the man who understood systems, who understood stress points and load capacities, and who understood failure. He saw the water lapping at the porch steps of the houses on the lower end of the street. He saw the rising threat, and then he looked at his own lawn, at the clean, undeniable line he had carved into the earth. The moat, it was not a weapon anymore. It was a tool. It was a solution. He pulled on his rain jacket and stepped outside. The wind and rain hit him like a physical blow. He went next door and hammered on Charles Alston's door. "We need to get people moving," Calvin said when Charles opened the door. There was no hesitation in his voice. No doubt, just the clear, calm authority of a man who saw the problem and knew the next 10 steps. Together, they went door to door. Calvin was no longer the quiet outsider. He was a commander. His voice cut through the roar of the storm. He directed the able-bodied men to check on the elderly residents. Charles, with his deep, reassuring presence, calmed the fearful. Mrs. Gable, 82 and frail, was trapped in her low-lying home, the water already covering her prize-winning roses. Calvin saw it. He ran back to his own yard. He grabbed the small remote from his pocket, the teak and steel bridge, his symbol of defiance. Word to life. He didn't lower it to the street. He raised it high. Then, with the help of 2 other men, he manually swung the entire platform around. Away from his driveway, they carried it, a makeshift gangplank, and laid it across the rising water. From the road to Mrs. Gable's front porch, a bridge to safety. But that was just the first problem. The water was still rising. It was beginning to threaten all the homes. Inching toward the historic foundations of Genevieve Devereaux's mansion at the highest point of the street. Shovels, Calvin yelled over the wind. Get every shovel you can find. He stood at the edge of his moat, the rain plastering his gray hair to his head. He pointed to a low spot in the curb. We need to break through here, he commanded. We're going to dig a channel. We're going to give this river somewhere else to go. He was the first to strike the earth. The shovel sank into the saturated lawn. Others joined him. Men in soaked golf shirts and gardening boots, digging alongside him. They were no longer neighbors. They were a crew, and he was their chief engineer. They dug a trench. A disperate, muddy channel, connecting the flooded street to his moat. The moment the final barrier of mud and grass was breached, the water surged. It poured into his creation, a controlled cascade. The moat, designed with perfect gradient and drainage, did exactly what it was built to do. It accepted the flood. It channeled the water. It carried the destructive force away from the homes, directing it safely toward the overflow basin at the edge of the community. From her second-story window, Genevieve Devereaux watched. She saw the man she had tried to expel. The outsider, she saw him standing in the heart of the storm, covered in mud, directing the very people she was meant to lead. She saw her neighbors, working together, their faces grim with determination, and she watched as the ugly, defiant scar he had carved in front of his house became the one thing that saved hers. The water that had been threatening to swallow her legacy was being tamed. It was being diverted by his design, her heritage, her tradition, her beautiful, perfect community. All of it was being saved by the one man who had dared to defy her, by the one thing she had hated most. The foundation of her house was secure, but the foundation of her world, the one she had built over a lifetime of control and tradition, had just been washed away. The bridge to healing. The storm was gone. In its wake, it left a profound silence. The next morning, the sun rose into a sky washed clean, its light spilling over a landscape that was bruised but not broken. The residents of the Oaks of Savannah emerged from their homes, not as individuals checking on their own property, but as neighbors. They were a community forged in the wind and the rain. The great fallen oak tree, the one that had started as a weapon, became their first project together. They worked for days with chainsaws and borrowed trucks, clearing the road. Calvin Hayes was not just among them, he was with them. His quiet expertise, once used to build a fortress, was now used to help rebuild a neighborhood. He showed them how to brace a weakened retaining wall, how to safely clear debris from a damaged roof. He was no longer the outsider, the newcomer. He was simply Calvin, their neighbor. Word of what had happened during the storm spread faster than any news report. The story was no longer about a man who built a moat to fight the HOA. It was about a man who used that same moat to save his neighbors. The news vans returned ag.ui. But this time, their stories were different. They were stories of heroism, of community. The order from the City Heritage Committee was scheduled for a hearing, but it never came to that. Facing a flood of supportive letters, a petition signed by every single resident of the Oaks, and the quiet pressure of a city that had found a new local hero, the committee officially rescinded the order. The moat was safe. It was no longer a symbol of defiance. It had become a landmark. Pierce Dalton's name vanished from the HOA's official correspondence. His whispered plans of real estate development dissolved with the floodwaters. Like many men of his kind, he simply faded away when the ground was no longer profitable to stand on. A few weeks later, a formal, cream-colored envelope appeared in Calvin's mailbox. The familiar, elegant logo of the HOA was at the top. His hand tightened for a moment. A reflexive defense against a battle he no longer needed to fight. Inside, a single sheet of paper announced the official resignation of Genevieve Devereaux as president, effective immediately. There was no explanation. There was no farewell. The next afternoon, a small delivery truck pulled up to Calvin's house. The driver carried a single, large potted plant to his doorstep. It was a rare variety of azalea, with delicate, snow-white blossoms. There was no card, no note, but Calvin knew who had sent it. It was not an apology. An apology was not in Genevieve's nature, but it was an acknowledgement, a concession, a peace treaty in the form of a flower. Calvin took the azalea and planted it in a place of honor. Right beside the edge of his moat, he made sure it was placed with perfect symmetry, not out of obsession, but out of respect. The months that followed were quiet. A new HOA board was elected, this one made up of neighbors who talked to each other, led by a soft-spoken retired teacher who believed in consensus, not covenants. They even asked Calvin to serve as a consultant on a new community safety committee. He accepted. The story ends on a warm afternoon in late autumn. The oppressive heat of the Georgia summer had finally broken, leaving behind a soft, golden light. Calvin and Charles Alston sat on Calvin's front porch, two old friends, watching the world go by. The iced tea in their glasses sweated in the gentle warmth from the street. They could hear the sound of children laughing. A new family had moved into the neighborhood, and their kids were endlessly fascinated by the moat. They would sail little leaf boats in its clear water. Charles took a slow sip of his tea. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I never did ask. That bridge of yours, that beautiful piece of engineering, what did it finally cost you?" Calvin looked out at his creation. The water glittered in the sun. The teak bridge, lowered and welcoming, spanned the gap. He thought about the invoices, the cost of the concrete, the steel, the hydraulics. Then he thought about the real cost, the year of anxiety, the sleepless nights, the confrontation with a past he had tried so desperately to bury. "Less than I thought," Calvin said, his voice clear and steady. "And more than I ever expected to gain." He looked at the tools in his garage, no longer arranged with frantic precision, but simply put away, ready for the next useful project. He looked at the empty space in his life that Eleanor had left, a space that no longer felt like a void, but like a quiet room filled with cherished memories. The control he had been searching for wasn't in the perfect lawn or the perfectly aligned tools. It was never about the rules. It was about connection. It was about accepting that some things, some cracks in the world, could not be fixed, only lived with, and lived through. He had not escaped the memory of that bridge in Baltimore. He had simply built a new one here in Savannah, not of steel and concrete, but of water and wood and shared experience. A bridge that had carried his neighbors to safety, a bridge that had finally, after 5 long years, carried him home to himself. And in the quiet peace of his own front porch, Calvin Hayes, the engineer, the widower, the neighbor, was finally happy. What does it truly mean to build a bridge? For Calvin Hayes, it started with digging a moat, a line drawn against a world that felt unjust and out of control. We saw him turn grief and frustration into a brilliant act of defiance, not with anger, but with the quiet precision of an engineer. Perhaps the most moving moment was not the storm, but the simple act of planting a flower, a silent truce offered by his adversary. Genevieve, showing that even the deepest divides can be bridged by a shared understanding. Calvin's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest structures we build aren't made of stone and steel, but of courage and connection. It teaches us that the path to healing our own past often begins when we unexpectedly find ourselves serving others. What did you feel watching Calvin reclaim his peace? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If stories like this resonate with you, perhaps you might consider subscribing to Deepu Cater Stories. Thank you for spending your time with us. It's a privilege to share these journeys with you.